Section 24 of A Popular History of France, Volume 4. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Kathy Barrett. A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times, Volume 4, by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 30. Francis I and the Reformation, Part 4. We have dwelt in detail upon these two martyrs, Leclerc and Berquin, the wool carder and the scholarly gentleman, because they are faithful and vivid representatives of the two classes amongst which, in the 16th century, the Reformation took root in France. It had a double origin, morally and socially, one amongst the people and the other amongst the aristocratic and the learned. It was not national, nor was it embraced by the government of the country. Persecution was its first and its only destiny in the reign of Francis I, and it went through the ordeal with admirable courage and patience. It resisted only in the form of martyrdom. We will give no more of such painful and hideous pictures. In connection with this subject, and as regards the latter portion of this reign, we will dwell upon only those general facts which bear the impress of public morals and the conduct of the government rather than of the fortunes and the feelings of individuals. It was after Francis I.'s time that the Reformation, instead of confining itself to submitting with dignity to persecution, made a spirited effort to escape from it by becoming a political party and taking up in France the task of the opposition. Religious wars which, from the death of Francis I to the accession of Henry IV, smothered France in disaster, blood, and crime. In the reign of Francis I, from 1524 to 1547, 81 death sentences for heresy were executed. At Paris only, from the 10th of November to the 2nd of May, a space of some 6 months, 102 sentences to death by fire for heresy were pronounced. 27 were executed, 2 did not take place, because those who ought to have undergone them denounced other reformers to save themselves, and 73 succeeded in escaping by flight. The Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris, pages 444 to 450, does not mention sentences to lesser penalties. In a provincial town, whose history one of its most distinguished inhabitants, M. Boutiot, has lately written from authentic documents and local traditions, at Troyes, in fact, in 1542 and 1546, 2 burgesses, one a clerk and the other a publisher, were sentenced to the stake and executed for the crime of heresy, "on an appeal being made by the publisher, Mas Moreau, the Parliament of Paris confirmed the sentence pronounced by the bailiff's court," and he underwent his punishment on the Place Saint Pierre with the greatest courage. The decree of the Parliament contains the most rigorous enactments against books in the French language treating of religious matters; and it enjoins upon all citizens the duty of denouncing those who, publicly or not, make profession of the new doctrine. "The Lutheran propaganda," say the documents, "is in great force throughout the diocese. It exercises influence not only on the class of artisans, but also amongst the burgesses. Doubt has made its way into many honest souls. The Reformation has or by fear of danger. There is no human greatness before which I do not prefer Christ's glory. One thought alone gives me pause. I doubt my ability to do any good. I fear it is impossible to obtain from the king that which I regard as necessary for the Lord's glory and for the peace of France. You know that kingdom; pronounce your judgment. If you think that I shall do well to undertake the journey, I am off." Melancthon had good reason to doubt whether success, such as he deemed necessary, were possible. Whilst Francis I. was making all these advances to the Protestants of Germany, he was continuing to proceed against their brother Christians in France more bitterly and more flagrantly than ever. Two recent events had very much envenomed party feeling between the French Catholics and Reformers, and the king had been very much compromised in this fresh crisis of the struggle. In 1534, the lawless insurrection of Anabaptists and peasants, which had so violently agitated Germany in 1525, began again. The insurgents seized the town of Munster in Westphalia, and there renewed their attempt to found the kingdom of Israel, with community of property and polygamy. As in 1525, they were promptly crushed by the German princes, Catholic and Protestant, of the neighborhood; but their rising had created some reverberation in France, and the Reformers had been suspected of an inclination to take part in it. "It is said," wrote the Chancellor de Granville in January, 1535, to the ambassador of France at the court of Charles V., "that the number of the strayed from the faith in France, and the danger of utter confusion, are very great. The enterprise of the said strayed, about which you write to me, to set fire to the churches and pillage the Louvre, proves that they were in great force. Please God, the king may be able to apply a remedy." The accusation was devoid of all foundation. But nothing is absurd in the eyes of party hatred and suspicion, and an incident, almost contemporaneous with the fresh insurrection of the Anabaptists, occurred to increase the king's wrath, as well as the people's, against the Reformers, and to rekindle the flames of persecution. On the 24th of October, 1534, placards against the mass, transubstantiation, and the regimen as well as the faith of the Catholic church were posted up during the night in the thoroughfares of Paris, and at Blois on the very chamber door of Francis I., whose first glance, when he got up in the morning, they caught. They had been printed at Neufchatel in Switzerland, where the influence of the refugee William Farel was strong, and their coarse violence of expression could not fail to excite the indignation of even the most indifferent Catholics. In their fanatical blindness, factions say only what satisfy their own passions, without considering moral propriety or the effect which will be produced by their words upon the feelings of their adversaries, who also have creeds and passions. Francis I., equally shocked and irritated, determined to give the Catholic faith striking satisfaction, and Protestant audacity a bloody lesson. On the 21st of January, 1535, a solemn procession issued from the church of Saint Germain Auxerrois. John du Bellay, Bishop of Paris, held in his hands the Holy Sacrament, surrounded by the three sons of France and the Duc de Vendome, who were the dais bearers, and the king walked behind, with a taper in his hand, between the Cardinals of Bourbon and Lorraine. At each halting place he handed his taper to the Cardinal of Lorraine, folded his hands, and, humbly prostrating himself, implored divine mercy for his people. After the procession was over, the king, who had remained to dine with John du Bellay, assembled in the great hall of the palace the heads of all the companies, and, taking his place on a sort of throne which had been prepared for him, said, "Whatever progress may have already been made by the pest, the remedy is still easy if each of you, devoured by the same zeal as I, will forget the claims of flesh and blood to remember only that he is a Christian, and will denounce without pity all those whom he knows to be partisans or favorers of heresy. As for me, if my arm were gangrened, I would have it cut off, though it were my right arm; and if my sons who hear me were such wretches as to fall into such execrable and accursed opinions, I would be willing to give them up to make a sacrifice of them to God." On the 29th of January there was published an edict which sentenced concealers of heretics, "Lutheran or other," to the same penalties as the said heretics, unless they denounced their guests to justice; and a quarter of the property to be confiscated was secured to the denouncers. 15 days previously, Francis I. had signed a decree still stranger for a king who was a protector of letters. He ordered the abolition of printing, that means of propagating heresies, and "forbade the printing of any book, on pain of the halter." 6 weeks later, however, on the 26th of February, he became ashamed of such an act, and suspended its execution indefinitely. Punishments in abundance preceded and accompanied the edicts. From the 10th of November, 1534, to the 3rd of May, 1535, 24 heretics were burned alive in Paris, without counting many who were sentenced to less cruel penalties. The procedure had been made more rapid. The police commissioner of the Chatelet dealt with cases summarily, and the Parliament confirmed. The victims had at first been strangled before they were burned; they were now burned alive, after the fashion of the Spanish Inquisition. The convicts were suspended by iron chains to beams which alternately "hoisted" and "lowered" them over the flames until the executioner cut the cord to let the sufferer fall. The evidence was burned together with the convicts. It was undesirable that the Reformers should be able to make a certified collection of their martyrs' acts and deeds. After a detailed and almost complacent enumeration of all these executions, we find in the Journal d'un Bourgeois de Paris this paragraph: "The rumor was, in June, 1535, that Pope Paul III., being advertised of the execrable and horrible justice which the king was doing upon the Lutherans in his kingdom, did send word to the King of France that he was advertised of it, and that he was quite willing to suppose that he did it in good part, as he still made use of the beautiful title he had, to be called the Most Christian King. Nevertheless, God the Creator, when he was in this world, made more use of mercy than of rigorous justice, which should never be used rigorously; and that it was a cruel death to burn a man alive because he might have to some extent renounced the faith and the law. Wherefore the pope did pray and request the king, by his letters, to be pleased to mitigate the fury and rigor of his justice by granting grace and pardon. The king, wishing to follow the pope's wishes, according as he sent him word by his letters patent, sent word to the court of Parliament not to proceed any more with such rigor as they had shown heretofore. For this cause were there no more rigorous proceedings on the part of justice." End of section 24.